Welcome to Releasing Your Inner Dragon, where story creators talk story creation. Drake is an award-winning fantasy novelist and creative writing teacher. You can find his epic fantasy series, The Genesis Oblivion, on Kindle Vella. Marie runs a fantasy world-building channel called Just in Time Worlds, and her first book, The Hidden Blade, is available on Kindle Unlimited. We hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Releasing Your Inner Dragon with Marie and Drake. Today is going to be an interesting topic because we're going to talk about quite a bit. It's much more story structure focused. We're going to talk about openings and endings and signposts and plot devices and twists and callbacks and how to use them effectively and make sure that you get the payoff that you're actually trying to get from these different devices that we're going to be using throughout the story.
And one of the first things that we should talk about in signposts and payoff is one of Drake's favorite movies, which is Finding Nemo. Because there is a scene right at the beginning where we talk about sharks and turtles. And then we get the payoff when Nemo's dad, when Marlin is almost on the right side of the theme, he's almost made it all the way through the journey, he gets to meet a turtle and ask it how old it is. And one of the ways in which he gets to the right side of the theme, one of the ways in which he overcomes the story blocks is by meeting a shark. So you literally have a very early signpost that provides enormous payoff towards the end of the middle and then end of the movie.
Yep. Because I use Finding Nemo in a lot of my classes because it's, like I said, I just think it's so brilliantly written and so easy to follow. And plus, the other thing that, like, a lot of people ask me, why do I use movies in my prose writing classes? First of all, I only use movies for the story structure classes. Like, I never use it for actual prose, teaching and grammar and all of that. But the biggest reason is because more people have seen more of the movies that I've seen than have read the books that I've read, because I can read some pretty eclectic fantasy stuff that no one's even heard of. And it's really hard to use those as examples. One of the things that I love about at that moment with the turtle and talking about the theme development, because it happens right at the end of Act 2. And the funny thing is, in the hero's journey structure, that would be called the atonement of the father. That's when the hero comes face to face with the answer to the theme, either from the negative side or the positive side. Because in Star Wars: A New Hope, Luke Skywalker, at the beginning of Act 2, Luke Skywalker has the atonement of the father moment where he watches Darth Vader kill Obi-Wan Kenobi. And that's normally where that usually falls into, is more closer to the beginning of Act 2, where you're going to show the audience the ultimate of what could happen with this big plot that we're doing in this thematic element. And yet, in Finding Nemo, that moment actually happens at the end of Act 2. And I love the reason why they do it, because before then, Marlin's not ready. So we've talked about this a couple of times. Remember, the main theme is what type of parent to be. Should you be an overprotective parent that never lets your child have any freedom at all? Or should you allow them to have some freedoms, make some mistakes, but be there to make sure that they don't die, while they're growing up? And so what that turtle represents, not only is it a great callback to the whole, the sharks, the turtles, all the stuff that he says, you can't go out there because it's way too dangerous and you're going to die. Not only is it call back to those and allow us to get over those, things and growth moments, but it's also the dad who's like, dude, you just got to let the kids be kids, man. It's the only way to before that, if you had said that to Marlin, he would have been like, screw you, you're wrong. No, never. But after, by that point, he's still not ready to say yes. He's absolutely not ready to say yes at that point, and he doesn't.
Yeah.
But he's willing to listen. He's willing to contemplate. By that point, the audience knows. The audience is like, yeah, that's the guy you should have been. That turtle, even though he's stoned out of his mind, that's what you should have been as a parent. And so we get it because, it's a kid's movie. So you get the theme, you know what you're doing, as an adult when you're watching that movie. But so there's so much beautiful about that. And that's the thing, when you're looking at the hero's journey, it's not about, sure, you could follow it step by step, Star Wars: A New Hope, why I use Star Wars: A New Hope when I'm teaching the hero's journey, because Lucas followed it. He had just gotten out of class with Campbell, the guy who created it. So he actually went to the actual classes, and he was like, well, Professor Campbell said to do this first, and so I'm going to do this first. And Professor Campbell said to do this second, and I'm going to do like, so he literally just followed it straight through, which is why I use it as the basis of my hero's journey class. You can absolutely put those elements in the locations that they're kind of taught at. One of the most brilliant, and the only thing that I really, really appreciate from Stephen King, is The Shawshank Redemption. Blew me away when I found out that he wrote it, because I'm not a fan of his stuff. And yet, when you actually understand the protagonist is the actual protagonist, and is somebody that is innocent that you want to root for, happens in Act 3. That's something you normally develop in the everyman moment in Act 1. So, normally that's, but you kind of go through that whole movie going, yeah, but he killed his wife. Yeah, but he killed his wife. I know he says he didn't, but I mean, they even play off of that, because they have that moment where he walks into prison and he's like, I'm innocent. And they're like, yeah, I'm innocent too. And I'm innocent. And everybody's like, yeah, everyone in this prison is innocent. Right. And so it's this beautiful moment where you as the audience go, yeah, I mean, I saw him with the gun. He probably killed him. like he probably did it. And then in Act 3, you're like, oh, damn, he's innocent. And then you actually get the payoff of climax of that movie, and you root for him at that point wholeheartedly. And so brilliantly written. And that's where you get that payoff to the setup.
And it is beautifully signposted right at the beginning, because if you look back at the beginning, right, once you know that he's innocent, you can see that he was innocent. But if you look at it first time and you don't know that he's innocent, it looks like he could maybe be guilty.
Yeah.
That kind of signposting. You can also see it so clearly in John Steinbeck's novella of Mice and Men. Now, I don't know if you've read it. I don't know if our audience have read it, so I'll briefly recap. So essentially, there are two guys who are in the Depression era in America, Lenny and George. Lenny is big, but Lenny is mentally underdeveloped. He's got a very childlike mind, despite the fact that he is a grown man. And he likes petting soft animals, but unfortunately, with his great strength and the mental issues, he kills them. He and George get work at this farm, and they talk about how much they want to own their own farm where they can work in peace. And then they meet a guy called Candy, who's like, he's got $350 back in the 30s. That was a lot of money. So he'll chip in and they can buy a farm, and the three of them can own the farm together. And it seems golden. It looks like this thing is going to steer out to a happy ending and everybody's going to have a great day. But this is a John Steinbeck novel. The rancher they're working for has got a son named Curly who has a wife. The wife flirts with Lenny. Lenny explains to her that he has trouble petting things that he loves. She says, well, you can pet me. And he touches her hair. She freaks out and screams. Lenny reacts as you would expect and kills her. Feel good book of the century. Then Lenny runs away. And George arrives back with the other guys on the ranch. They discover the dead woman's corpse. A lynch mob forms because this is the 30s. And George runs off ahead of the lynch mob to try and find Lenny at the river where they said they'd meet up, where he does meet Lenny. And there he tells Lenny again this dream of the farm they're going to own. And as Lenny is standing there all relaxed and so on, George shoots him dead in the head, because that would be kinder than leaving him to the lynch mob who arrive shortly afterwards. The reason why I say that this is a well signposted tale is because right at the beginning, you're told Lenny has problems petting things. And then he kills the girl. And then you get to the lynch mob. Yep. It's especially poignant because there's a Black character in there, bearing in mind, again, 1930s America. So there's a Black character in there that at one point, this the woman that Lenny kills threatens the Black guy with the lynch mob. So you've got all of these call outs, that really builds to a conclusion. It's a great book.
So I equate all of that when I'm teaching this, and this goes also for plot devices. So like whatever your character uses. We talked a couple times about the pot of boiling water that Drake's going to throw on the attacking ninja. That's a plot device. And in story hooks are the same thing, where we're putting these plot devices in that we're going to use as our story hooks. The way I always teach it is, think like a farmer. You've got to plant it. You've got to tend it at least once before you can reap it.
Yep.
If you can tend it a couple times, even better. But you've got to plant it, tend it, and reap it. You can't just reap it. You can't just, because then nobody understands the payoff. They don't get why it's important. They lose the thing. The example that I always use, not to come a little bit closer to our time, as from the 1930s, is Shyamalan. His first movie, which is arguably his best piece that he produced. I think he went downhill. I loved Unbreakable. I thought that was really good too, but I still think Sixth Sense kind of edges it out. And you go through that whole movie. I'm gonna spoil it, but if you haven't seen it by now, sorry.
If you haven't seen
go
Sixth
through that
Sense,
whole movie, and everything is there, and then at the very end is when you learn, oh crap, the protagonist is dead and has been dead the whole movie. And you don't feel cheated because your mind instantly they do a good job of also kind of showing you what you missed, but your mind goes back and goes, oh crap, like all the breadcrumbs were there. Everything was there that I should have seen, should have picked up on, should have saw. It's all there to let me know that Bruce Willis is dead before the story started. And so that's a great, you've got all you call them signposts, I call them, story hooks or plot devices, whatever. But we're saying the exact same thing. You have to plant this stuff if you're going to use it. If you don't plant it, you can't use it. I also, for items, I call it the 400 foot of rope phenomenon. And this comes from, I think I've told this story before, but this comes from an unpublished thing that I read. And this one main character ended up trapped on this cliff with literally no way off. It said that literally no way off. Luckily, he remembered to bring 400 foot of rope. And it's like, but where? Like, he doesn't have a backpack that I know of. He doesn't, like, what? How? And that happens all the time. I read that everywhere.
So another good example, let me prove that I can bring happy examples to the table. Tremors, the 1980 movie. Now, Tremors 2, 3, 4, and 5 are trash. Don't watch them.
Yeah, watch them. They're fun. they're just monster movies at that point. The story has taken a back seat.
But Tremors 1, and specifically here, what I want to call out is that icebox. Okay? So Tremors 1, the opening scene, our two main characters get out of their car and walk into this one-horse town store, general store. And as they're buying the stuff from the counter, there's an icebox behind them that starts this whirring cycle. Because it starts, you notice it, and everybody notices it. They turn to it, they talk about it.
Right. Okay. That's the important part. The important part is the characters go, whoa, what is that? Yeah. I'm like, oh, it's the old ice mugs outside. Yeah. Like it's discussed. It's brought up so the audience knows.
You don't really notice it there, right?
Well, let me add why that's so cool, because it is much more subtle, even though you still bring it up. But back in the 50s and 60s, what they used to do was horrible and way less subtle. You're in a murder mystery and the murderer was, associated with this one restaurant. And so as he's leaving, the matchbook falls out of his pocket that he got when he was at the restaurant, and the camera zooms down onto the matchbook, and the matchbook fills the whole screen, and the music goes dun, dun, dun. And that's literally their way of going, hey, audience, we know you are stupid as a brick. So let me make sure you 100% cannot miss this matchbox. So, the nice thing about modern stuff and modern, movies and storytelling is that we have started to figure out that you don't have to do the zoom in. And so the icebox was brilliant.
The icebox is nice and subtle. You know about it. It does its thing. Then the movie itself
And you
starts.
forget about it.
You forget about it. You completely forget about it because the movie itself starts and you have monsters tunneling up through the earth, eating your protagonists. Well, not your protagonist, but everybody around them.
Yeah.
And they figure out that these things are attracted to vibrations in the earth. And they all end up in the store. They've now gotten a handle on it. Things in the movie are starting to calm down. You're sort of towards the back end. You're not quite at the end yet, but you're about halfway. So you're like, okay, they've started figuring it out. It's going to be cool. And then that freaking refrigerator starts up. And the next minute, they're all like running around, unplugging the thing, going crazy because, like us, they've forgotten about it. And up through the floor pops one of these big eating monsters and, eats like half the store. That was the most beautiful signpost.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a great, this is what you have to do to get any payoffs, to get the callbacks, to get anywhere you're going. It's the reason why it's so important. It's why the hero's journey structure works. It has these built-in hooks for you to know, oh, I've got to do this. Creating the everyman, when you understand that and all the different hooks that have to go into that, you understand why it has to be, because I have to like the character to actually give a crap about the character so that I actually care about the story and them overcoming the story.
But
and
now,
if you fail to do that.
Now, let's talk about big budget that freaking doesn't do this. If you haven't seen Game of Thrones season 8, I'm sorry. I'm going to spoil it for you. If you have seen it and you don't care, just keep watching. In season 8, one of the main things that made me want to stab the writers in the face in a non-violent way is in one half of one episode, Jon and Dany are both riding dragons and they're sailing through this beautiful moonlit scene together. It's all love and roses and sunshine and Disney princesses. And it's not even half a scene later. Like it might be that same episode or it's the next episode. And Dany's off her rocker and burning King's Landing to the ground. How? There was no tending of this madness plant. It just popped up fully formed. And that's a big budget production. Tremors was made on a shoestring.
Yeah. Yeah, it was called that was back when they were making $1 million films.
Yeah.
So very low budget B grade films.
It's a B grade film and it's beautiful. The storytelling's lovely.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said, they lost it, as they went further into the series because they started just focusing on the monster. And I think that's the thing. So big budget. Here's the problem with big budget. A lot of the times they just lose their way. There's a lot of people who have the power to input their opinions that know nothing about storytelling. And they think they do. And that's the problem. There are so many people who think they can do what I do, what you do. It's like me saying, I could be a doctor. I could be a surgeon. Technically, that's true. I absolutely could be a surgeon had I spent, I'm 52 now, I'm not going to do it now, but, had I spent the 12 years going through and doing all the education on it, I absolutely could have done it. But it doesn't mean I can walk into a hospital tomorrow and operate on somebody. That would be called a serial killer. And because I would kill them. I don't know nothing. When a studio throws $2-3 million at someone today, $4 million at someone today, they're like, whatever, that's out of petty cash. Go make your little movie. It's like Kevin Smith. Miramax didn't really pay a lot of attention to Kevin Smith because they're like, oh, we did pretty good with Clerks. You want what, $4 million to do? Because they did Clerks off of, I want to say $100,000 was the budget for it. And I'm doing memory, so I could be wrong on that. And it literally is a guy named Scott Mosier just paid for it. He just was like, I got $100,000. And so he literally just paid for it. And Mosier's still not only in a lot of the films, but also still the producer of all this stuff. He's, that's, they had met in film school, if I remember correctly. But when they went to do Mallrats, you're going from $100,000. I want to say it had a $4 million budget, maybe a $2 million, but I think it was $4 million. And so, from a filmmaker standpoint, I just made a movie for $100,000 and now I got $4 million. But the studio is like, yeah, we got that in petty cash. Just go take your weirdness and go have your little weird movie. And, they had very few notes. The funny thing is a couple of the notes would have drastically changed everything. Like one of the big notes that they had was they didn't like Jason Mewes playing Jay, from Jay and Silent Bob. But they were like,
but that was the whole point.
Right. So they were like, he sucks. You will not cast him. He cannot be in this movie. We will not give you the money if he's in. Like they literally dug their heels in. And luckily Kevin Smith went the other route and was like, no, and so they ended up doing some shooting and testing, and they kept showing it to him. And eventually the studio was like, all right, fine, whatever. It's $4 million. What do we care? And that's the thing. When you get into the 80 million, 100 million, 200 million, 280 million, like, the Avengers, that's a lot of money that people can lose their jobs over. And so they're like, well, my job is on the line. Even though I'm not a storyteller and never knew anything about this stuff, I'm still going to kind of micromanage a little bit heavier than I would normally, because I could lose my entire livelihood off of this if it doesn't go right. And so I understand the draw to do it, but it's still the wrong move.
I understand as well, but so I'm going to unload a little bit on Star Wars 7, 8, and 9. If you like those movies, good for you. I didn't. Well, I didn't like them because of a lot of reasons, but there were a couple of reasons that really, really griped me. The first is Snoke. Okay, so Snoke to me is an example of a signpost with no payoff. In movie 1, we have the shadowy figure in the background, and he's not revealed to us. Okay, so there is a promise of things to come in the next movies, the way we got with the Emperor, except that in the next movie, he's stabbed in the face and dies. That
very
is not
unceremoniously.
Very unceremonious. There's nothing to it.
And to me, it read like, okay, because the problem is they didn't have consistency as writers, they didn't have consistent directors, they didn't have consistency in anything. So to me, it read like the new guy was like, well, that's just an inconvenience. I don't want to deal with this. I'm just going to kill him.
Yeah, that's exactly what it read like. That's exactly what it felt like. Signpost, payoff, completely unrelated. No payoff at all. I am left feeling unfulfilled.
Yeah.
Okay? The first example. The second example is the example of zero signpost, but I'm going to explain it to you after the fact. Okay, which we call in prose telling. Just if you were wondering, that's what telling looks like in a movie.
And info dumping as well.
Yeah. So I forget which one of the stupid trilogy it is. I might really dislike this movie. I had such hope. Anyway, so there's this scene where the rebel forces are racing through the hyperspace, and they're being chased by the First Order guys, and they run out of fuel, and now they have to debark the ships. So they jump into these small pods and they start fleeing towards the planet below. But now the First Order ship has come out of hyperspace and is literally blowing up the ship they're fleeing from. Okay. And I mean, why are these little ships safe? We have no idea. Okay. And then Poe turns to General Leia, to Carrie Fisher's character, and says, why wouldn't they shoot us? And I don't know how this woman managed to deliver it with a straight face. She should have gotten an Oscar for being able to pull this line off. She says, they weren't scanning for small ships, or they won't scan for small ships.
They're not looking out the window.
Yeah.
Everybody's distracted.
So that is literally like nothing. Like I can't even. Okay. So now she's explained to us how this payoff happened that we've just received. Then 5 minutes later, they now need to be putting pressure onto these little ships. So now all of a sudden the First Order realizes, oh, we should be scanning for it, and they start scanning for it. We've just been told they won't. Do you know how much money went into those movies for them not even being capable of looking at this payoff in the script and going, maybe we should breadcrumb some of the stuff elsewhere?
There's so many times in some of these big budget films that I go, how did no one in the writer's room? Because, usually these big budget films have 6, 8, 10, sometimes 12 writers. You don't know this because only 3, by rule, by Hollywood rule, only 3 writers are allowed to get credited as writers. So a lot of times I'll watch these and I'm like, how did no one in the writer's room bring this up? Like it's so blatantly obvious. Just send me the script. Let me read the big budget script. Pay me a little bit of money. I'll read it. I'll point out your big, massive, stupid errors, and then you can go about your business.
How I truly don't understand how they missed this in the read-throughs. It's so blatantly obvious that one viewing of the movie immediately, it's just, I can't even.
So there are a couple answers.
Yeah.
First of all, very few elements of a movie production see the whole picture. A lot of times the director, unfortunately, is not allowed to have anything to do with the editing side of it. And so maybe those scenes were shot and the editor's going through and like, I don't understand why they shot this scene. I'm not putting it in here. It makes no sense to me. And so, that's why a lot of times we get the director's cut. What the director's cut is the director is furious that the editor ruined his vision and made him look like an idiot, because nobody cares about the editor. So, it's like the movie's bad. It's like, oh, that director sucks. And the director's like, but I shot those scenes. Like, they should have been there. And so there's just there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of, and again, the studio can come in and direct. I don't want this. I do want that. You must do this. So unfortunately, on some of this stuff, not all of it, Zack Snyder and the whole Justice League, like Joss Whedon is one of my favorite writers. That for his version of the Justice League was abysmal. And so I was really excited to finally see, because there were so many things that just didn't make any sense to me in that movie. And then I'm like, oh no, Zach's gonna come back. He's gonna no, really not any better, just different. And so
okay, I'll give Zack Snyder's director cut this. It made more sense.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
100%.
It made more sense. Like there were still things that were
yes.
But it did at least make sense. The Joss Whedon cut actually didn't make sense. Like there was not a coherent story.
And again, you're talking about a guy who came halfway through a project, a bunch of stuff already filmed. He's got to, it's sort of like my favorite director that I think is the most brilliant man in Hollywood is Ron Howard. I think Ron Howard is the most knowledgeable. He hasn't made 100%, great movies. And also he's made movies that are not in my genre that I'm not going to really appreciate anyway. But from an intelligent standpoint of understanding story structure and understanding audiences, I do not think there's a man smarter than Ron Howard. And the funny thing about Ron Howard is before the 3 prequel Star Wars movies were made, he went to George Lucas and said, man, I really love this Star Wars thing. Let me write the prequels. I'd like to write and direct the prequels. And Lucas was like, nah, we're never doing those. I mean, can you imagine how different that franchise would be if he had just allowed one of the most brilliant minds in Hollywood to actually take the reins of that? Like, I don't think we have it.
Almost anybody else wrote that.
Right. And we can definitely agree on that. At this point, now flash forward and Disney owns the Star Wars. And I'm rooting for Star Wars to fail because every movie is worse than the last. Just go away. I don't want you in pop culture anymore. I don't want to have to talk to you. You're so horrible. You literally are detracting. By the time Disney takes over Star Wars, I am rooting for it to fail.
Yeah.
And so they start making Solo. And this is going to be the iconic piece. And I'm looking at who's writing it, looking who's directing it. And I'm like, this is going to be a freaking train wreck. I cannot wait for this to come out. Everyone's going to hate this. It's going to literally put the final death nail into Star Wars. Unfortunately for me, but fortunately for the fan base, some of the cast actually went behind the writers and directors' back and went to the studio and was like, this is horrible. Here's how they described it. They described it as Ace Ventura in space. And so the studio then started looking closer at the dailies and were like, this is horrible. And they fired the writer director. And they turned to Ron Howard to come in and salvage it. Now they're like, but you can't reshoot anything. We don't have that kind of budget. And so Solo was actually a decent movie as well. It's one of the only ones that I kind of appreciated. But unfortunately, just like Joss Whedon was straddled with a lot of footage that he could not reshoot, Ron Howard had the same situation where he's coming to a project that's more than half done. He has to, come in and fix using these pieces that already exist. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into big budget. That I'm a huge Ryan Reynolds fan. I think he's brilliant. And I think he's legitimately brilliant. Not a brilliant actor, not a brilliant director, he's legitimately brilliant. He had been fighting to do Deadpool Ryan Reynolds is literally the only reason why we have Deadpool. And he had been fighting for it for a decade, trying to get it. He finally got it. He really kind of manhandled the whole project and got the writers that he wanted and got the story that he wanted and all that. And they did it very low budget. And he goes into Deadpool 2 and they're like, ooh, the big holdup for Deadpool 3 has been, and they finally got over it because I'm pretty sure it's now in development. But the big holdup is they were like, you're going to have an $80 million budget on this. And Ryan Reynolds was like, no, we're not. I'm not doing it. And they're like, no, you're going to have an $80 million budget. And he's like, no, it'll ruin my movie. I do not want that. And literally for years, it didn't get into development because he was fighting the fact they were giving him too much money. Because he knew, like I said, he's a brilliant man and he understands that money brings complications. And so I think that's a lot of another reason why that people just don't think about. There's just so much really
you get badly structured stories as well.
Yeah.
Now, some of it is self-published stories, sure, but there are some big published names that have had some story structures like. I don't know if you put yourself through the horror of trying to read J.K. Rowling's adult books, the ones she wrote.
No, I read at one of them and was like, wow, I'll just live in my memory of how good Harry Potter was and be done with it.
So I'm pretty sure those were published on her name alone, but
actually they weren't.
Okay.
When she first wrote the first one, she refused to allow the publisher to use her name. It sold almost no copies. It got bad reviews. And so finally she was like, fine, put my name on. And then it sold gangbusters. Still didn't get great reviews, but it sold gangbusters.
But that's my point, is like there are some authors who do this story narrative thing not at all. And not always. Sometimes they do it great. And then 2 books later, you're like, what happened to you? Did you get hit in the head?
Yeah. Because they feel, and that's kind of where I was going. This will bring us back around where I was going with sequels and stuff. They feel they have to follow a different path, a different structure, a different whatever. And a lot of times they try to make up a structure, and that's where they fail so miserably. So when you look at someone like a Nora Roberts, if you've read one Nora Roberts book, you've read every single Nora Roberts book. She follows a very defined path.
She writes romance, doesn't she?
She writes romance.
Yeah.
But she is one of the best-selling authors, and they buy her books over and over and over again because they all deliver exactly what the audience is looking for.
I don't look down on romance writers because I know that wherever they are, they're looking down on my literary pretensions from a mountain of money.
Right. Why do you think I write romance? Although I haven't written in a couple of years, but I've got 2 romance novels that I've got to get back to and get onto the market.
Because if you can write romance, it is a mountain of money.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And it's also, in my opinion, easier for me to write. There's more simplistic stories. It's like a vacation from my much more hardcore epic fantasy.
Yeah. But Nora Roberts writes in a structured fashion. I'm assuming. I don't really read romance, but I assume that she does.
We talked about the same thing with John Grisham.
Yeah.
If you've read one John book, you've read them all. If you've read one Tom Clancy book, you've read them all. You know, it's not a bad thing to follow the same structure, because you're giving the audience exactly what they're looking for every time, and that works. But I think that's where a lot of sequels fail, is they're like, oh, we have to come up with something that absolutely is nothing like the first one. And so and a lot of the reboots are the same way. You look at the reboots of whatever, the Ghostbusters, Total Recall, like just all these reboots of these movies, they're all terrible. There hasn't been one single reboot that I walked out of and went, that's as good as the original. Not one. They've all been worse, all across the board. And I think one of the big traps they fall into is, you know, the first one was successful because it has these structures and these elements that absolutely work. And so they're like, we can't use any of those. It's like, well, but you're literally, you know, you're playing Russian roulette with an automatic pistol. You really can't play Russian roulette with an automatic pistol. You're going to die every time. And that's kind of what they're doing. So, and these are all the things to kind of bring it back into the topic that we're talking about. Why are we talking about this stuff? Why do we go down all these rabbit holes of all these different stories? Every one of them is the fact that they're not understanding that you have to set things up to get a payoff of, and you have to get your payoff. So you have to set them up. And I think, you know, this is really the one that's going to put me the most in people's bad lights, because I'm going to poo-poo something that is literally an industry favorite, and that's Stranger Things. So I love Stranger Things. Watched all 3 seasons, cannot wait for season 4 to drop. However, the ending of season 1 was incredibly weak. It literally was just and then the ending of season 2 was even weaker. The ending of season 3 was even weaker. The leading up to it was fantastic. They just didn't capitalize on a payoff.
They didn't stick the landing.
They did not. They tumbled and fell and laid there and cried while the judges gave them, and they still got 9s and 10s, but they
I mean, it was magnificent up to that point.
It really was. And I absolutely am a huge fan of that. So I'm not poo-pooing on those on that IP, but and that's a lot of writers struggle with endings. I struggle with endings, but the difference is I'm not going to give. I'm going to keep going and keep going and keep going and keep going until I finally figure out what is that ending. I'm going to try out different things. I'm going to let different people read different things. I'm going to get feedback. I'm going to, because I know that the genius is in the editing. So I'm going to keep going and keep going and keep going until I find that ending that has that dramatic impact.
And if you're Lord of the Rings, you make 5 endings and put them all in the movie.
That's, again, Lord of the Rings would never be published today.
But I'm remembering that movie. You're like, oh, you're still talking.
So the funniest part to me when I saw Lord of the Rings in the theater was you could tell who'd never read the books before, because the story would end and it would fade to black and half the audience stepped up or stood up, and then the movie came back in and they sat back down, and then the story completely ended. Movie's over, fade to black, half the audience stood up, and then the movie came back up and half the audience sat back down, and then the movie continued. And it was you could tell, like, don't get up yet, it's not, we're not done.
To our audience, Tolkien got away with that because he was the first. You won't.
1952.
You will not get away with it.
No. And the book won't sell today anyway. No. If Lord of the Rings didn't happen, if it didn't exist, if something else was the first, and you wrote Lord of the Rings today, exactly what was written, you would never get it published. If you self-published it, it would get panned. It would have a horrible review. I truly believe that for a lot of reasons.
Maybe because Tolkien's prose was special. Like his prose is special.
Special is an interesting word to use for it.
It is well, it is well written.
It is, but unfortunately, it's a different language.
Yes.
We don't speak that way. You know, he
No,
grew up in the early
we don't.
1900s.
Yeah.
So we don't speak that way anymore. And
No.
so there's the complication of that. It was incredibly telly. Incredibly
Yes.
telly. Nobody had made the mistake of, you know, this is an epic fantasy book. So shouldn't I write 3 or 4 chapters of them just walking through things? Shouldn't I do that? Doesn't that sound like a good idea? We're just going to walk and walk and walk. See, nobody had made that mistake yet. And so it was a good idea at the time. And then we read that and went, oh, if you're writing epic fantasy, don't write 4 chapters of them walking across fields. That's bad. You know, he made those first mistakes for us. It's you know, it's one of the reasons why I thank George Martin. My entire writing career, and I wrote my first book when I was 12. My entire writing career, I have always had this thought that I was going to kill every character that I introduced in a story. I was just going to introduce characters and just wantonly kill them for no story reason. And I was like, oh my God, isn't this a great idea? And then George Martin did it. And I realized it's a hugely successful IP, but that's not the part of it that makes it successful. Everyone hates that. And so I'm like, oh, I'm not going to do that. Thank you, George. I now know that's a bad thing.
He literally just killed too many good characters.
Yeah.
Now, and actually, Martin is an ideal example of really not paying off.
Yes. I get in this argument all the time with people
because he gives you, like, I think it's like chapter 2 or 3, they find those direwolf pups. Okay. And I mean, it's like prophesied puppies. There's exactly enough for each of the stock children. There's one for John that's ghost colored. Okay, so there's a couple of things he does here. The first is, if you read it very carefully and you really know stuff, okay, you can get a sense of the final fate of the characters from the names. Like Rickon, the little boy, he calls his shaggy dog, which apparently is a movie term for a distraction character. That's not actually important. Summer for Bran makes sense because Bran starts as a summer child. You know, Ghost for John, etc., etc., etc. But he sets up these direwolf puppies in this way, everything about it. And then he just doesn't pay it off. Like those dogs get killed, they run away, they do this, they do that. But as an epic fantasy reader, I am left unfulfilled. For me, the biggest problem with Ned's death is not actually Ned's death. It's that Ned's death is lost in the slew of deaths that follow. If Ned's death meant something in the next book, if it got all of his children on board with us, if Arya didn't stop getting distracted to everywhere and everything, you know, if it really meant something. But in the end, Ned's death meant nothing. It meant nothing.
His argument is it's realistic. That happens in the real world all the time. My argument is stories aren't realistic. Stories are not about being real. They're about doing exactly what stories need to do.
If I wanted to listen to War of the Roses, I would listen to a podcast by somebody like Mike Duncan. Now, Mike Duncan has recently brought out a book that I recommend to everybody called A Hero of Two Tales. A Hero of Two Revolutions, the story of the Marquis Lafayette, which is an exceptionally well-researched non-fiction book that tells the story of the Marquis Lafayette in a storyish fashion. And in there, Mike Duncan actually makes a reference to the fact that the Marquis, in one battle scene, right, where he's fighting with George Washington, because he's part of the American Revolution, right? So he's fighting, he's with George Washington, and the general that he's facing on the other side, the English general, is the same English general as killed his father when he was just a little boy. But he never knew that. That battle went by, he won the battle, that dude withdrew to England, he never met him. That fated plot, you know, moment that stood there so beautifully never happened because history is not a plot device.
Right.
But history is not a plot device.
Right.
If I was writing if I was writing a fictionalized version of Marquis Lafayette's story, like a fictionalized version, he
Right.
would absolutely meet that dude right there on that battlefield, and he would know that that dude was the guy who, you know, commanded the armies that killed his father.
And actually, you would have put the information in sooner. Hey, this is, you know, just letting you know, we just found out who killed your father or whatever. So you would get this way early on. Yeah, I mean, because that's storytelling. Storytelling is not history. And you know, in my character development class, usually there's this one scene or this one moment where I'm talking that usually spawns someone in the audience to go, well, wait a minute now. I know people like that. I know, because I talk about what you should not write in a secondary, tertiary character. And they're like, but I work with people like that. There's people in my office that are exactly like that. Wouldn't you want to do that for realism? I'm like, look, no, because, you know, I work with those people too. I don't want to read about them. They're not interesting. Like, I don't want them, even as a tertiary character. I don't want them. And so, yeah, that's the thing. It's all of this ties into the whole payoff thing. I think we've gotten off track quite a bit.
We have a bit, but it is ties back to the story structure thing. Like, you're telling a satisfying story. History goes on forever. There is no plot to history. It is what it is. But that's not what you're writing.
Some things happen in history that are beautiful plot device story moments.
Absolutely.
But it's just random chance that it happened that way.
It's random chance. Like, when you are the author, it is your job to make a satisfying story by providing the reader with a believable setup.
Yep. 100%. And that's really just to kind of tie everything up and bring us back to where we started. You know, all of these things, if you don't have the setup, if you don't plant this stuff, and it's everything from, again, it can be a plot device. You know, like I said, I call it the 400 foot of rope theory. You can't have 400 foot of rope show up out of nowhere. You have to plant it. You have to have made comments, mentioned it, brought it up. It's the same thing with your thematic elements. It's the same thing with your character elements. It's the same thing with your development elements. It's the same thing with your emotional elements. Things have to bring the audience into an understanding so that when those payoffs happen, they get the most impact out of them. Without the setup, the impact doesn't happen. So you have to have these things. You have to, and some things you can't. I mean, some things literally do come out of the blue and hit them, and you have to do kind of in retrospect. Some things can be done. My favorite moment,
but then it's a bus moment, right? The buses hit you.
Right. We've already talked about that with Meet Joe Black. My favorite moment of the instant description setup to the payoff that happens instantly is still from The Princess Bride, where she's like, but are you afraid of the R.U.S? And he goes, rodents of unusual size? I don't think they exist. Bonk. Like, it's literally right there. So, but
The Princess Bride is a masterclass.
Oh, it is. It's brilliantly written. But I mean, that's that. It's still, you set it up and you pay it off. Now, you set it up literally the second before you paid it off. But it's so funny because, again, what are you setting up? A rodent of unusual size. That's just ridiculous. And so then when it happens, it's just more ridiculous, and it's perfect, and it's exactly the tone and the fit. And again, this is just understanding all of these elements that you're doing. But a rat didn't just hit him out of nowhere.
No.
And even with Meet Joe Black, even though that comes out of nowhere, it comes out of nowhere for the reason of being the most shocking way to get to the actual story, which is Joe's dead.
It's your inciting incident, and your inciting incident can come out of nowhere.
Yeah.
As long as you then spend the rest of the story exploring the strange new world and the hero figuring out where they are.
Yep. Marie's more of a pantser, more of a discovery writer than I am. I'm more of a plotter than Marie is. It doesn't matter which side of that equation you're on, because one is right for you and one is wrong for you. Or the similarity is you got to still do the same job. So where I don't rewrite almost anything, as far as like what I mean by that is I don't write chapters that get cut or get thrown away or get whatever. When I write a chapter, it already fits into the puzzle. The puzzle has already been created. I've already got all the outlines of where the piece, what size the piece is and everything and all that. Marie doesn't necessarily. That's the thing about being a pantser or a discovery writer is you're still discovering some of that story elements. And so that means you might write a chapter that you end up having to cut. Because it just doesn't, you thought the puzzle piece was going to fit, you wrote it, you put it into the puzzle, it doesn't fit.
Doesn't.
And so you either rewrite it or throw it away or whatever. Neither is quicker. So don't think, oh, so you're faster. No, I waste a ton of time thinking about the story before I write it. She wastes time writing the story before she thinks about it. Yep. And again, not in a negative way. It's just
absolutely
it's just the writing style that we have.
And in both cases, you have to make sure the story structure is there. Like as a pantser, I go back and I edit chapters to put in the breadcrumbs to make the payoff at the end. Because sometimes I'll end up writing a payoff and I'm like, oh, that's a beautiful payoff. Wait, did I? No, I didn't. Okay, hold on. Where can I go breadcrumb?
Yep. But that happens as a plotter too. In the story that I just wrote for The Realm, at the end, one of the secondary characters says something and it's something, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's something like, well, it's like I said earlier, blah, blah, blah. And then I highlighted it and I clicked add comment, and the comment reads, he needs to say this at some point. Because I know he didn't say it. He never said it, but it fits so perfectly, and it literally needs to be a callback line. It can't just be a first line. It has to be a callback line. So I made the note somewhere before this, so now I have to find that moment that organically I can slip this in or change a line so that it becomes this or whatever, so that I can have the callback. But the callback's already there. I've already written the callback. I just haven't written what it calls back to.
So as we said,
all the time.
If you're going to throw the kettle of boiling water at the ninja, you'd better boil it. It's a good place to end this episode. And Absolutely. We'll see you soon for another one.
Hey guys, Drake here. Thank you so much for listening to Releasing Your Inner Dragon podcast. I hope you're getting a ton of information and maybe even some nuggets of gold that you can take into your own writing to help you on your journey of story creation. A couple things I want to throw at you. First of all, for the first time in years, I am opening myself up to being a private mentor again. If you would like for me to work with you to improve your writing right now, reach out to me. You can either go to my website, maxwellalexanderdrake.com, and send me a contact form, or just email me at author@maxadrake.com. Also, as many of you may know, I've been out of the novel game for quite a few years. I was the lead fiction writer for EverQuest Next from Sony. I've been in the movie and TV industry for a few years now, but I am excited to say I'm back into the novel game. I've actually been working on a novel for a little while now, and I'm going to start dropping it on Amazon's Zavella. So if you're on that platform, look me up, Maxwell Alexander Drake. Thank you again for listening, and as always, keep writing.
Hi guys, this is Marie from Releasing Your Inner Dragon, and I hope you're enjoying the podcast. If you're interested in more content on fantasy world building, head over to YouTube and look up Just in Time Worlds. I release tons of content there. If you'd like to check out my book, The Hidden Blade by Marie M. Mullaney, it is available as an ebook, audiobook, and print book on Amazon. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.